Hi there. Please let your mind slow down and go at ease, and let me know in the comments where you're from. Also, what's your best tip for a peaceful night's sleep and keeping a calm mind? Whether it's a relaxing bedtime ritual, a favorite book, or a mindfulness practice, your advice could be just what someone needs. The empty house next door. When I moved into my new apartment, I was happy to discover it was part of a quiet, friendly neighborhood. Most of the residents had lived there for years, and they welcomed me warmly. But there was one exception. The house next door, which stood empty, its windows dark, its yard overgrown. The house had a worn, abandoned look, its paint peeling, its roof sagging. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it had been left vacant for some time. But one night, as I was closing my curtains, I noticed a light flickering in one of the windows. It was faint, just a soft orange glow, like a candle burning in the darkness. I watched for a moment, half expecting someone to step into view, but the light remained steady, casting strange shadows over the walls. The next morning, I asked one of my neighbors about it, but he just shook his head, his expression darkening. "That house has been empty for years," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "No one goes in there. They say it's haunted." I laughed it off, trying to ignore the chill that crept over me. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as though someone or something were peering at me from those darkened windows. Then, one night, I heard it, a faint, soft knocking, coming from the direction of the empty house. It was slow, rhythmic, like someone tapping gently on a door, and it filled the air with a heavy, unsettling quiet. I went to the window, pulling back the curtain, and saw the light again, flickering in the upstairs window. This time, the shadows seemed different, shifting and moving, as though someone were walking through the house. I watched, heart pounding, my gaze fixed on the window, and that's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible, standing in the shadows. It was just a faint outline, blurred and indistinct, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and unblinking, watching me. I backed away, heart racing, and closed the curtains, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to me. But the knocking continued, growing louder, more insistent, filling the night with a hollow, echoing sound that seemed to press down on me, suffocating. The next day, I decided to investigate. I walked over to the empty house, my heart pounding as I climbed the steps to the porch. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open, revealing a dark, silent hallway filled with shadows. The air inside was cold, thick with the scent of dust and decay, and I felt an overwhelming urge to turn back. But something compelled me forward. I wandered through the empty rooms, each one filled with an eerie quiet that seemed to hold its breath, as though the house itself were listening. As I reached the stairs, I heard it again. The faint, soft knocking coming from the second floor, echoing through the silence. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath my weight, the air growing colder, thicker as I approached the source of the sound. When I reached the top, I saw it, the flickering light glowing from beneath a closed door at the end of the hallway. I hesitated, heart pounding, but something drew me forward, compelling me to open the door. As I stepped inside, the room fell silent, the light extinguished, leaving only darkness and a thick, suffocating quiet. And then I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck, a presence lingering just behind me, filling the air with a sorrowful, haunting energy. I turned, but the room was empty, silent, the shadows thick and unyielding. I left the house that day, the memory of that presence haunting me, filling my mind with a dread I couldn't shake. And now, every time I pass by that darkened window, I feel its gaze, watching, waiting, a reminder of the spirit that lingers in the shadows, waiting for someone to hear its call. The girl in the mirror. Growing up, I had an old, antique mirror in my bedroom, a tall, ornate piece with an intricately carved wooden frame and a glass surface that had grown slightly cloudy with age. It had been in my family for generations, passed down from one relative to the next, and my mother had always told me it was special. But from the moment it arrived in my room, I felt uneasy, as though the mirror held secrets, shadows hidden just beneath the surface. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something strange. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement in the mirror, a faint, flickering shadow that seemed to shift and move as I watched. I turned, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Only my own reflection staring back at me, my face pale and anxious. But as the days passed, the movements became more frequent. I would catch glimpses of something, a shadow, a faint outline of a figure standing just behind me, barely visible in the dim light. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light. But the figure grew clearer, more defined, until I could no longer ignore it. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a soft whisper, barely audible, like a voice speaking from just beyond the glass. I sat up, heart racing, and stared into the mirror, my eyes searching for any sign of movement. And then, slowly, she appeared. It was a girl, her figure faint, blurred, as though she were part of the glass itself. She was pale, her eyes dark and hollow, her expression filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to reach into my soul. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me, her gaze unblinking, her presence filling the room with a heavy, suffocating silence. Who are you? I whispered, my voice trembling. The girl tilted her head, her gaze never leaving mine, and in a voice barely more than a breath, she spoke. Help me. The words echoed in the silence, each one filled with a desperation that made my chest ache. I felt an overwhelming urge to reach out, to touch the glass, to comfort her, but a deep, bone-chilling fear held me back. Over the next few nights, the girl continued to appear, her presence growing stronger, her gaze more intense, filled with a sorrow that seemed endless. Sometimes I would hear her whispering, her voice soft and faint, drifting through the silence, pleading for help, for release. Desperate to understand, I asked my mother about the mirror. She looked at me with a sad, knowing expression, her gaze filled with a sorrow that mirrored the girl's. There's a story, she said softly, that the mirror holds the spirit of a girl who died tragically, a girl who was never able to move on. They say she waits, trapped in the glass, searching for someone to set her free. That night, I tried to ignore the mirror, to avoid her gaze, but her presence was constant, unrelenting. She appeared again, her figure clearer than ever, her gaze filled with a desperation that seemed to reach into my very soul. I couldn't bear it any longer. I stood before the mirror, my hand trembling as I reached out, pressing my fingers against the cold glass. Her expression softened, her eyes filled with a strange, haunting gratitude. And for a moment, I felt a deep, overwhelming sorrow, a sadness so profound it left me breathless. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone, leaving only my own reflection, pale and shaken, staring back at me. The mirror fell silent, its surface clear, still, as though nothing had happened. I don't see her anymore, but sometimes, when I glance at my reflection, I feel her presence, a weight pressing down on me, a reminder of the spirit I set free, the girl I left behind in the shadows of the glass, the radio that played at midnight. I'd always loved collecting old things, relics from another time that seemed to carry stories of the past. My most recent find was an old, battered radio from the 1940s. Its wood was scuffed, the dials worn, but it had a strange charm that drew me in. The shopkeeper told me it hadn't worked in years, but I was determined to bring it home. That night, I set it up in my living room, admiring its vintage look. It added a certain character to the room, a piece of history nestled among modern furniture. I tried turning the dials, hoping for a faint hum or a static-filled crackle. But the radio was silent. I laughed, telling myself it was just an antique, a decoration, nothing more. But just after midnight, I heard it, a faint, crackling sound coming from the radio. I sat up, heart pounding, and watched as the dials turned on their own, stopping on a station I didn't recognize. The crackling faded, replaced by soft, haunting music, a melody filled with sorrow and longing that seemed to echo through the room. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, but I couldn't look away, couldn't turn it off. The music continued, filling the air with an eerie, otherworldly sound that made my skin prickle. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped, leaving only silence, thick and heavy. The next night, it happened again. At precisely midnight, the radio crackled to life, the dials moving on their own, stopping on the same unknown station. But this time, there was a voice, a soft, faint whisper, barely audible, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The voice was filled with sorrow, its tone haunting, as though it were calling out from another world. I tried to turn it off, to unplug it, but the voice continued, echoing through the silence, filling the room with a heavy, oppressive weight. I backed away, heart racing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something, or someone, was listening from the other side of the radio. Each night, the voice grew louder, more insistent, the sorrow in its tone deepening, filling the air with a sadness that seemed endless. Sometimes I thought I heard my name, whispered faintly, as though the voice knew me, as though it were calling to me, begging for release. Desperate for answers, I took the radio to an antique expert, hoping to learn more about its origin. The man examined it, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. Finally, he looked at me, his gaze filled with a strange mix of pity and fear. This radio, it once belonged to a man who disappeared in the 1940s, he said slowly, his voice barely more than a whisper. They say he used to sit by it every night, listening to the same station, the same song, until one night he just vanished. I left the shop that day, the weight of the radio pressing down on me, filling me with a dread I couldn't shake. That night, as midnight approached, I sat in silence, watching the radio, waiting, my heart pounding in anticipation. And at the stroke of 12, it came to life, the dials turning, the voice returning, filled with a sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. The whisper grew louder, filling the room, each word laced with a desperation that seemed endless, timeless. Let me come back. I haven't touched the radio since. I keep it covered, tucked away in a closet, hoping to silence its haunting call. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear it, the faint, sorrowful melody drifting through the walls, a reminder of the spirit that lingers, waiting, hoping to find its way back. The shadow by the lake. There's a lake in the forest near my childhood home, a place I'd always found beautiful yet eerie. The water was dark and still, surrounded by tall, looming trees that cast long shadows over the surface. As kids, we'd often go there to skip stones, to explore, but we always left before dark, fearful of the stories we'd heard. The locals spoke of a shadow that haunted the lake, a figure that appeared only at night, gliding silently across the water, watching, waiting. They said it was the spirit of someone who had drowned long ago, bound to the lake, searching for something or someone to take their place. One summer evening, just before sunset, I found myself alone by the lake, lost in thought as I watched the water ripple softly in the breeze. The air was still, the silence thick, and I felt a strange pull, a compulsion to stay, to watch, to see if the stories were true. As darkness fell, the shadows deepened, stretching across the lake, casting strange patterns over the water. Just as I was about to leave, I saw it, a faint outline, barely visible, standing on the far side of the lake. The figure was tall, its form blurred and indistinct, like a shadow that had come to life. I stood frozen, my heart pounding, watching as the figure moved closer, gliding silently over the surface, its movements slow, deliberate. It stopped a few feet from the shore, its gaze fixed on me, and I felt a chill crawl down my spine, a heavy, suffocating dread that made it hard to breathe. The figure raised a hand, beckoning, its movements slow, filled with a sorrow that seemed endless. I felt an overwhelming urge to step forward, to approach, but fear held me back, rooting me in place. "Come closer," it whispered, its voice soft, barely more than a breath, filled with a longing that made my chest ache. I shook my head, backing away, but the figure continued to beckon, its hand reaching out, its gaze unblinking, intense. The air grew colder, thicker, filled with an oppressive weight, and I could feel its sorrow, its desperation, filling the air with a heavy, haunting energy. The figure moved closer, its form flickering, like a shadow caught in the wind, and I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind reeling with fear. I wanted to run, to leave, but its gaze held me in place, its voice echoing in my mind. Please, don't leave. The words echoed across the lake, filling the night with a sorrow so deep it seemed to seep into my bones. I turned, finally breaking free, and ran through the forest, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The memory of its voice haunting me, filling me with a dread that clung to me like a shadow. Since that night, I haven't returned to the lake, too afraid of what I might find. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, I see it, a faint figure standing at the water's edge, watching, waiting, its sorrowful plea lingering in the air, a reminder of the shadow I left behind in the darkness. The stranger in the garden. When I moved into my new house, I was delighted to find it came with a large garden. It was beautiful but neglected, overgrown with wild flowers and tall, untamed grass that swayed in the breeze. The garden was surrounded by a tall hedge, giving it a secluded, almost secretive feel, and I spent many afternoons working to restore it, trimming back the hedges, planting new flowers, creating a space of peace. But as the weeks passed, strange things began to happen. I would often find things moved, garden tools left in odd places, plants disturbed as though someone had been walking through the garden. I told myself it was animals or even my own forgetfulness, but a sense of unease lingered, growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, just as the sun was setting, I saw him, a figure standing at the far end of the garden, barely visible in the dim light. He was tall, thin, dressed in dark clothes, his face hidden in shadow. I froze, watching him, my heart pounding, but he didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, silent and still, his presence filling the air with a strange, heavy energy. I called out, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on something beyond me, his posture unnaturally stiff. I backed away, feeling a chill crawl down my spine, and hurried inside, locking the door behind me, hoping he would be gone by morning. But he wasn't. The next day, as I went out to water the plants, I saw him again, standing in the same spot, his figure barely visible among the shadows. I felt a strange compulsion to approach, to see who he was. But fear held me back, rooting me in place. The days passed, and the figure continued to appear, always in the same spot, always watching, waiting. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of him out of the corner of my eye, just a flicker of movement, a shadow standing among the flowers. His presence filled the air with a heavy, oppressive dread, as though the garden itself were haunted, bound to something dark and sorrowful. One night, unable to sleep, I went to the window, looking out over the garden. The figure was there, his form barely visible in the moonlight, his gaze fixed on the house. I felt a chill crawl over me, but something compelled me to go outside, to confront him, to understand why he was haunting my garden. I stepped into the cool night air, my heart pounding as I approached him, the silence thick, pressing down on me. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, his gaze unblinking, his posture unnaturally still. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. The figure turned slowly, his face hidden in shadow, his eyes dark, empty, filled with a sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. He raised a hand, pointing to the ground beside him, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a realization that filled me with a cold, hollow fear. The next day, I dug in the spot where he had pointed, my hands trembling, my heart pounding as I unearthed a small, weathered box buried deep in the earth. Inside was a faded photograph of a family, a man, a woman, and a child, their faces filled with a happiness that seemed hauntingly out of place. I looked closer, feeling a chill as I recognized the man's face. It was the same face as the figure who had haunted my garden. I buried the box again, my mind reeling, my pulse racing, and that night, when I looked out the window, the figure was gone, leaving only silence, a heavy, sorrowful silence that lingered in the air, a reminder of the stranger I had laid to rest. The clock that stopped at midnight. When my grandfather passed away, I inherited an old, ornate clock that had been in our family for generations. It was a beautiful, intricate piece, its wooden frame carved with delicate patterns, its hands crafted from brass, polished to a faint golden sheen. I placed it on the mantel in my living room, admiring its craftsmanship, the way its steady ticking filled the room with a comforting rhythm. But one night, just after midnight, the clock stopped. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it needed winding, but as I reached for the key, I felt a strange chill, a heavy, oppressive energy that seemed to seep from the clock, filling the air with a thick, unnatural quiet. I hesitated, pulling my hand back, and that's when I noticed the hands. They had stopped at exactly midnight, their golden tips pointing sharply upward, as though frozen in time. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a coincidence. But a sense of unease lingered, gnawing at me, filling my mind with a dread I couldn't shake. The next night, it happened again. The clock ticked steadily throughout the evening, its rhythm comforting. But at midnight, it stopped, the hands freezing in place, the air growing colder, heavier, filled with a silence that seemed alive, listening. I began to feel as though I were being watched, as though something were lurking just beyond my sight, hidden in the shadows, waiting. The air grew colder, each tick of the clock filling the room with a weight that pressed down on me, suffocating, as though time itself were bending, twisting, bound to something dark and ancient. One night, as midnight approached, I sat in silence, watching the clock, my heart pounding, my pulse racing in anticipation. The hands moved slowly, each tick echoing in the silence, filling the room with a haunting, rhythmic beat. And then, at exactly midnight, it stopped. The hands froze, the air growing colder, thicker, filled with a sense of dread that seeped into my bones, filling me with a fear I couldn't explain. Just as I was about to turn away, I heard it, a soft, faint whisper drifting through the silence, barely audible, like a voice speaking from beyond the grave. "Help me." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I stumbled back, my mind racing, my heart pounding. The voice continued, its tone filled with sorrow, with a longing that seemed endless, timeless. "Set me free." The air grew colder, the silence thicker, and I felt a strange compulsion to reach for the clock, to touch its frozen hands, to listen to the voice that called to me from beyond the veil. The next day, I took the clock to a family historian, hoping to understand its origin. She examined it carefully, her expression growing darker as she traced the intricate carvings. The faint, barely visible symbols etched into the wood. "This clock, it's cursed," she said slowly, her voice filled with a strange mix of fear and sadness. "It's bound to the spirit of someone who died at midnight, someone who could never move on. They say whoever owns the clock will be haunted by their voice until the curse is broken." I left the clock with her, unable to bear the thought of keeping it, of hearing that sorrowful voice, that haunting plea. But even now, in the dead of night, I hear it, the faint, rhythmic ticking, the soft, mournful whisper, a reminder of the spirit I left bound in the frozen hands of the clock, the door that never closed. When I moved into my new apartment, everything seemed perfect, except for one strange detail. In the hallway, there was a small door, no taller than my waist, built right into the wall. It was painted the same color as the wall, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. I assumed it was some kind of storage space or access to pipes, but when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. The hinges were rusted, the knob barely turning, as though the door hadn't been opened in years. At first, I didn't think much of it, figuring it was just an odd quirk of the old building. But as the days passed, I began to notice strange things. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find the door slightly open, just a crack, barely enough to see into the darkness beyond. I would close it, making sure it was shut tight, but each morning it would be open again, as though someone or something had been through it in the night. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a faint sound coming from the direction of the door, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking. I froze, listening, my heart pounding as the tapping grew louder, more insistent, filling the air with a hollow, echoing sound. I approached the door slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. The tapping stopped, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence that seemed to press down on me, filling the air with a heavy, oppressive energy. I pulled the door shut, feeling a strange, irrational fear that something was watching me from the darkness beyond. But that night, I dreamt of the door. In my dream, it stood wide open, revealing a narrow, dark hallway stretching into shadows, filled with a strange, cold mist that seemed to seep through the walls. I felt a strange compulsion to step through, to see what lay beyond, but a deep, primal fear held me back, rooting me in place. When I woke, the door was open again, just a crack, as though inviting me to look inside. I knelt down, hesitating, my heart pounding as I peered through the gap. I could barely see anything, just darkness, thick and unyielding. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A faint, ghostly figure standing in the shadows, its gaze fixed on me, its eyes dark, empty, filled with a sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. I stumbled back, my mind racing, and slammed the door shut, hoping to seal whatever was inside. But every night, it would open again, just a crack, as though the figure were waiting, watching, biding its time. One night, unable to take it any longer, I decided to leave. I packed my things, leaving the apartment and the door behind. But even now, I still see it sometimes, in dreams and fleeting glimpses, a reminder of the door that never closed, the shadow that waited for me in the darkness. The crying in the basement. Growing up, my family lived in an old house with a large, dark basement. It was a damp, cold space filled with old boxes, cobwebs, and strange, musty smells that seemed to seep into the walls. I'd always hated it, avoiding it whenever possible. But every so often, my parents would send me down to fetch something. A jar of preserves, a tool, or a box of holiday decorations. One winter evening, just as I was reaching the bottom of the stairs, I heard it, a faint, soft crying, drifting through the silence. The sound was distant, barely audible, like someone sobbing quietly, their voice filled with sorrow and despair. I froze, heart pounding, my mind racing, but the crying continued, echoing through the darkness, filling the basement with a haunting, sorrowful tone. I called out, half expecting a reply, but the only answer was silence, thick and heavy, pressing down on me, suffocating. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but the crying continued, growing louder, more desperate, filling the air with a sadness that seeped into my bones. Each time I went to the basement, the crying would return, soft but insistent, echoing from somewhere deep within the shadows. My parents never seemed to notice, brushing it off as pipes or old wood creaking. But I knew it was something else, something haunting, bound to the house, unable to find peace. One night, unable to ignore it any longer, I decided to follow the sound, hoping to understand, to find the source of the sorrowful voice that haunted the basement. I crept through the darkness, my flashlight casting eerie shadows over the walls, each step filling me with a growing sense of dread. The crying led me to a small, locked door in the far corner of the basement, one I had never noticed before. The door was old, its wood dark and splintered, the knob rusted, barely turning as I tried to open it. I called out, hoping for a response, but the only answer was silence, thick and unyielding. As I turned to leave, the crying grew louder, filled with a desperation that made my chest ache, filling the air with a sorrow that seemed endless. I felt an overwhelming urge to open the door, to help whoever was on the other side. But fear held me back, rooting me in place. Over the years, the crying continued, always faint, always filled with that same haunting sorrow. And now, even though I no longer live in that house, I can still hear it sometimes, a faint, distant sound that echoes in my mind. A reminder of the spirit I left behind, forever crying in the darkness of the basement. The reflection that wasn't mine. When I first moved into my new apartment, I loved the large vintage mirror that hung in the bedroom. Its ornate silver-gilded frame and cloudy glass gave it a timeless, elegant look. It had been left by the previous tenant, and I liked the way it reflected light from the window, casting soft glows around the room at night. But after a few days, I started noticing things in the reflection that didn't quite make sense. At first, it was subtle. I'd catch glimpses of movement, a shadow that didn't match my own, a faint outline hovering in the background. But each time I looked closer, it was gone, leaving only my reflection staring back at me, my face slightly paler, my eyes slightly wider. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, maybe an effect of the glass being old and warped. But the strange movements continued, becoming more defined, more deliberate. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I caught a glimpse of something that froze me in place. In the reflection, I saw myself standing by the mirror as usual, but behind me was a figure, a woman, faint and ghostly, her face hidden in shadow, her head tilted as though she were studying me. She was wearing a long, dark dress, her hair hanging loose around her shoulders, and her posture was unnaturally still, her gaze unblinking. I turned around, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, a sense of dread seeping into my bones, and when I looked back at the mirror, the woman was gone. I tried to brush it off, to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the memory of her face lingered, filling me with an unease that I couldn't shake. Over the next few nights, the woman continued to appear, always in the mirror, always watching, her expression growing more sorrowful, more desperate. I began to avoid the mirror, glancing at it only when necessary. But each time, her presence grew stronger, her figure more defined, as though she were stepping closer, trying to reach through the glass. One evening, I decided to confront her. I stood before the mirror, staring into the glass, waiting, my heart pounding, my hands trembling. For a moment, there was nothing. Only my own reflection, my face pale, my eyes wide. But then, slowly, she appeared, emerging from the shadows, her gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Who are you?" I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. The woman's expression softened, her eyes filling with a deep, endless sorrow, and she raised a hand, pressing it against the glass as though trying to reach through. I felt a strange pull, a compulsion to reach back, to touch the glass, to listen to the silent plea that lingered in her gaze. As I placed my hand against the glass, I felt a sudden bone-chilling cold seep through my skin, filling me with a sense of dread so deep it made my chest ache. The woman's eyes widened, her face filling with a haunting gratitude, and in a voice barely more than a whisper, she spoke. "Thank you." Her words echoed in the silence, each one filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to seep into my soul. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone, leaving only my own reflection, pale and shaken, staring back at me. Since that night, I haven't seen her again, but I can't shake the feeling that I let something through, that her presence lingers, watching, waiting, a reminder of the reflection that once looked back at me, pleading for release. The dollhouse family. When I was 10, my grandmother gave me a beautiful Victorian-style dollhouse. It was an elaborate, handcrafted piece, complete with miniature furniture, intricate wallpaper, and tiny porcelain dolls that had been carefully placed in each room. I spent hours playing with it, arranging the furniture, creating stories for the little family who lived inside. But as I got older, I began to notice strange things about the dollhouse. I would arrange the dolls in certain positions, sitting at the tiny table, standing by the fireplace, and when I returned, they would be moved as though they had rearranged themselves. At first, I thought it was my younger brother playing a prank, but he swore he hadn't touched it, and my parents insisted they hadn't been near it. One evening, I decided to test it. I placed the mother doll in the parlor, the father by the staircase, and the children upstairs in their room. I took careful note of their positions, making sure they were exactly as I left them, and went to bed, hoping to catch my brother in the act. But that night, I had a strange dream. In it, I was standing in front of the dollhouse, peering through its tiny windows. Inside, I could see the dolls moving, their porcelain faces expressionless, their tiny limbs stiff and awkward as they went about their lives. The mother was sitting by the fireplace, her blank gaze fixed on the father, who stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. The children were in the upstairs room, their heads tilted, their faces turned toward me as though they were aware of my presence. I woke with a start, my heart pounding, my skin prickling with an unexplainable dread. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a dream, but the memory lingered, filling me with a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. The next morning, I went to check the dollhouse, my hands trembling as I opened the tiny front door. Inside, the dolls had moved. The mother was now standing by the door, her hand raised as though reaching for something or someone. The father was upstairs, his gaze fixed on the children, who were now positioned by the edge of the room, their faces turned toward the wall. A chill washed over me, and I backed away, my mind racing, my pulse pounding. I felt as though I were intruding, as though the dolls were aware of me, watching, waiting. Desperate for answers, I told my grandmother about it, hoping she'd have an explanation. Her face grew pale, her expression darkening, and she shook her head, her voice barely more than a whisper. That dollhouse, it was given to me by my mother, and to her by hers. They say it holds the spirits of a family who died tragically, bound to the house, cursed to live out their lives within its walls. I put the dollhouse in the attic that day, too frightened to keep it in my room. But even now, I can still feel their presence, sense their gazes, hear their faint whispers echoing through the walls, a reminder of the tiny family that lingers, forever bound to the dollhouse. The whispering attic. When my family moved into an old house on the outskirts of town, I immediately felt a strange pull toward the attic. The house was large, with creaky floors and high, echoing ceilings. And though my parents found it charming, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. But the attic was different. There was something about it that seemed to breathe, to pulse with a silent, watchful energy. The attic was accessed through a small, rickety staircase, hidden behind a door in the hallway. From my room, I could sometimes hear faint sounds coming from up there, soft creaks, an occasional thud, and if I listened closely enough, something that sounded eerily like a whisper. My parents dismissed it, saying it was just the house settling, but each night the noises grew louder, more insistent, filling the air with an eerie, hollow echo. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I waited until my family was asleep, then crept up the narrow staircase, holding a flashlight as I made my way to the attic. The door creaked as I opened it, and the air inside was thick and cold, filled with a damp, musty smell that made me shiver. Shadows danced across the walls, thrown by the beam of my flashlight, and I felt a strange, unnerving sensation, as though I were being watched. I wandered through the cluttered space, stepping over old boxes and furniture covered in dust sheets. The room was silent, save for the faint sound of my own breathing. But as I moved deeper into the attic, I heard it, a soft, whispering voice, barely audible, drifting through the darkness. "Help me!" I froze, heart pounding, and listened. The voice was faint, filled with a sorrow so deep it made my chest ache, and it seemed to come from somewhere just beyond my line of sight. I took a few steps forward, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight, and the whisper grew louder, filling the air with a haunting, echoing sound. "Please, find me." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I felt an overwhelming urge to turn back, to flee. But something compelled me to stay, to listen, to understand the plea that lingered in the air. I followed the sound, making my way to the far corner of the attic, where a large, ancient-looking trunk stood, covered in dust. The whispering grew louder, more desperate, and I felt a strange, pulsing energy emanating from the trunk, filling the air with a heavy, suffocating dread. My hands shook as I reached for the lid, lifting it slowly, heart pounding. Inside, there was nothing but an old, faded photograph, a picture of a young woman, her expression solemn, her eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed endless. I stared at the photograph, feeling a strange sense of recognition, a familiarity that I couldn't explain. And then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, the woman spoke. "Thank you for finding me." The words echoed in the silence, each one filled with a haunting, hollow gratitude that made my chest ache. I closed the trunk, backing away, and fled down the stairs, leaving the attic and its secrets behind. Since that night, the whispers have stopped, the attic falling silent, as though the spirit has finally found peace. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint sounds drifting down from above. A soft creak, a gentle thud, a whisper that reminds me of the spirit I set free. The stranger in the mirror. As a child, I was terrified of mirrors. Something about them unsettled me. The way they reflected everything so perfectly, yet seemed to hide something just out of sight. I always felt as though there was someone else on the other side, watching, waiting. When I was around 12, my parents bought an old mirror at an estate sale. It was large and ornate, with a silver frame carved into intricate looping patterns, and they hung it in the hallway outside my bedroom. At first, I tried to ignore it, to pretend it was just a piece of furniture. But each time I passed by, I felt a strange, prickling sensation, a sense of dread that made my skin crawl. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I glanced into the mirror and froze. There, standing just behind me, was a figure, a woman, tall and thin, her face pale, her eyes dark and empty. She was dressed in a long, tattered dress, her hair loose and tangled, and she was staring at me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. I turned around, heart pounding, but the hallway was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the woman was gone, leaving only my own reflection, wide-eyed and pale. I told myself it was my imagination, that it was just a trick of the light, but the memory lingered, filling me with an unease that I couldn't shake. Over the next few weeks, the woman continued to appear, always in the mirror, always just behind me. her expression growing more sorrowful, more desperate. I began to avoid the hallway, glancing into the mirror only when absolutely necessary. But each time, her presence grew stronger, her figure more defined, as though she were stepping closer, reaching out, trying to bridge the gap between our worlds. One night, unable to ignore it any longer, I decided to confront her. I stood before the mirror, staring into the glass, waiting, my heart pounding, my pulse racing. For a moment, there was nothing, only my own reflection, my face pale, my eyes wide with fear. But then, slowly, she appeared, emerging from the shadows, her gaze locking onto mine. Her expression was filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to seep into my soul, and she raised a hand, pressing it against the glass as though trying to reach through. I felt a strange pull, a compulsion to reach back, to touch the glass, to listen to the silent plea that lingered in her gaze. I raised my hand, pressing it against the mirror, and felt a sudden, bone-chilling cold seep into my skin, filling me with a dread so deep it left me breathless. The woman's gaze softened, her eyes filling with a haunting gratitude, and in a voice barely more than a whisper, she spoke. "Thank you." Her words echoed in the silence, each one filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to seep into my bones. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone, leaving only my own reflection, pale and shaken, staring back at me. Since that night, I haven't seen her again, but I can't shake the feeling that she's still there, lingering just beyond the glass, watching, waiting, a reminder of the spirit I set free.